So joining us live, we welcome in David Tafuri, former Obama campaign foreign policy advisor and former State Department official. David, thank you so much for being on this. Such a nuanced topic, very complicated. But what was your reaction to this call for Gazans to leave Gaza?
So this is not the official policy of the Israeli government, but these are statements by high-ranking Israeli officials, as you mentioned. And this is just bad leadership by Israel. If they were to force people in Gaza to leave Gaza, that would be against international law, it would be a violation of international law. It certainly wouldn't work well for Israel in the future, because most Gazans would likely refuse to leave, and it would only cause more consternation, likely lead to more violence. More importantly, though, there needs to be a two-state solution in Israel. And these officials who are talking about voluntary migration are really also saying that they don't believe in the two-state solution anymore. And unfortunately, if you look at polling, only about 30% of Jewish Israelis believe in the two-state solution, and only about 30% of Arab Israelis believe in the two-state solution. So we also have a problem in terms of the public view on this. But if you look deeper into the polling, it's not that they don't support it in the ideal. They don't support the two-state solution because they don't believe it's possible. And that's the result of a failure of leadership, both by the Israeli leaders and by the Palestinian leaders. We need better leaders in both the Palestinian territories and Israel. We need to get rid of Hamas, and Israel has a right to go after those responsible for the attacks on October 7th. But we need to get back on track to a two-state solution, and that includes giving people hope in Israel that a two-state solution is possible. It is possible, and it really is the only solution that's going to work in the future.
You know, and David, you brought up a good point. This is not the official Israeli government stance. This is coming from officials. But, you know, in spite of this pushback, these officials really don't seem to be dissuaded. They're doubling down on their calls for this movement. Does that surprise you?
It does surprise me in some ways, but remember, there are some extreme people in Israel. There are, extreme right-wing parties in Israel that support these types of policies. But I don't believe that it's the view of the majority of the population in Israel. And I would also note that the State Department very quickly responded to this and condemned it as an idea. The State Department spokesperson said the U.S. would not support that and condemned those Israeli officials who suggested it.
And David, let's just talk about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We say that it is constantly continuing to escalate. Talk about how bad things are right now.
Well, look, 80% of people who live in Gaza have been displaced. That's about 1.8 million people who are not in their regular homes anymore. Most people are on the edge of starvation. It's very difficult to get resources, to get food, to get water, even on a good day in Gaza before the October 7th attack. And so we also need to focus on getting more assistance into Gaza, and there has to be an end game here. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Israel has a right to go after all of those responsible for the attacks on October 7th, but it also has to be thinking about rebuilding Gaza and allowing other countries to help support the rebuilding of Gaza in order to provide more shelter and more homes for those 80% of Gazans who have been displaced, and to return them to situations where they have access to food, access to water, and access to the other things that they need, including medical care. And I don't see that happening enough yet. And that's one of the things that the U.S. is pushing very hard for. And that's part of what Secretary Blinken, I expect, will be talking about with Israeli officials on this visit.
And my last question for you, David. I mean, we are seeing, these continued visits by U.S. officials. How do you think this all ends?
Well, I think it's got to end with a solution that not only Israel and the Palestinian leaders and the U.S. agree to, but also neighboring countries that are important in this crisis, like Egypt and Jordan, and where there is a detente that Israel is never going to give up its right to continue to do offensive action against Hamas militants, but it does agree that it is not going to occupy Gaza, and it lets all the countries that I just mentioned support a unified effort to rebuild Gaza. And that is going to have to start with a temporary ceasefire, and then a permanent ceasefire, and then a rebuilding phase.
David Tafuri, always great to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you.